In the early summer of 2013, the vast landscapes of southern Alberta rested under a deceptively calm sky. The air was still, and the only movement was the gentle sway of wild grasses, undisturbed by any sign of trouble. The Rocky Mountains, ancient sentinels to the west, still wore a heavy cloak of winter snow. Their peaks stood silent, watching over the land as they had for millennia. It had been a long, cold season, and the snowpack was deeper than usual. The mountains held on to winter's memory, their slopes heavy with the weight of accumulated snow. Below, in the foothills and prairies, nature followed its familiar rhythm. Wildflowers opened to the sun, and the land seemed to breathe in quiet harmony. Rivers and streams meandered through the land, their waters calm and reflective, unaware of the immense power gathering high above them. The surface of the water mirrored the sky, betraying nothing of the danger to come. Nature, however, was preparing for an event of extraordinary scale. The sky began to shift, subtle at first, as if the land itself was holding its breath. A change was coming, carried on the winds from thousands of kilometers away. The first hints arrived as restless breezes, stirring the silence. The first signs were subtle, whispers of an impending shift in the atmosphere. The land, so used to cycles of sun and rain, sensed a disturbance it could not name. Far above, meteorologists watched their screens as a massive low-pressure system lumbered in from the Pacific Ocean. But on the ground the threat remained invisible, hidden in the shifting air and gathering clouds. Normally such systems would pass over the mountains and continue their journey eastward, leaving only fleeting traces behind. But this one was different. It encountered a formidable obstacle, a stubborn high-pressure system parked over the north, refusing to yield. This atmospheric blockade, known as a Rex block, forced the weather system to a halt. The sky became a battleground, with forces locked in a silent struggle. It stalled directly over the eastern slopes of the Rockies, a giant invisible machine ready to be switched on, poised to draw in moisture and unleash it upon the land below. High in the alpine meadows, the air began to feel heavy, thick with moisture. The scent of rain lingered even before the first drop fell. The first drops of rain started to fall on June 19th. They landed softly at first, barely disturbing the quiet. They were not the gentle showers of a typical June day. This was a relentless, soaking rain, the kind that seems to have no end. The sound of falling water grew louder, echoing through the valleys. It fell on the forests, the rock faces, and the still frozen ground. The land, unprepared for such an onslaught, began to change. Most critically, it fell upon the deep, lingering snowpack. The snow, once solid and unmoving, began to yield. The combination was potent. Each raindrop acted like a tiny hammer, melting the snow and releasing the water that had been locked away all winter. Beneath the surface, hidden rivers began to flow. The ground, already saturated, could absorb no more. Water pooled in every hollow, searching for a path downhill. What began as a trickle soon became a network of countless streams. The land's veins filled with water, pulsing with growing urgency. Water, the lifeblood of this region, was now becoming a threat. The balance had shifted, and the land braced for what was to come. It flowed down every gully and ravine, merging and growing in volume and speed. The landscape, shaped by eons of gentle erosion, now faced a sudden, violent transformation. The creeks that were usually gentle and clear began to turn brown with mud and churn with newfound energy. The water's song became a roar. The stage was set for a deluge of historic proportions. The land, sky and water had conspired in silence, and now their secret was about to be revealed. The mountains, which had stood silent for so long, were about to release a torrent of water that would reshape the land and test the spirit of everyone in its path. The flood of floods had begun. The unseen threat had revealed itself, not with a warning, but with unstoppable force. The rainfall that swept across Alberta in June 2013 was not merely a heavy downpour, it was the result of a rare and intricate meteorological ballet, where multiple atmospheric forces collided with devastating precision. This was not a single storm, but a symphony of weather phenomena, each amplifying the other, culminating in a deluge of historic proportions. At the core of this event was a stubborn, stalled low-pressure system anchored over the Rocky Mountains like a massive atmospheric engine. This system, unable to move eastward due to a blocking high-pressure ridge, became a magnet for moisture and instability, setting the stage for an extraordinary event. The true catalyst, however, was an atmospheric river, a colossal, invisible conveyor belt of moisture, stretching thousands of kilometers from the subtropics. This river in the sky is a phenomenon where narrow corridors of concentrated water vapor are transported across continents, capable of carrying more water than the Amazon River at its mouth. This particular atmospheric river drew its moisture from both the warm Pacific Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico, funneling a staggering volume of water vapor directly toward Alberta. The convergence of these two moisture sources intensified the system, creating a supercharged corridor of humidity. The corridor, narrow but potent, was aimed with surgical precision at the foothills of the Rockies. The amount of moisture it carried was unprecedented for the region, far exceeding typical seasonal levels. As this river of vapor collided with the mountains, the air was forced to rise rapidly, a process known as orographic lift. The Rockies, acting as an immovable wall, squeezed the moisture from the air, intensifying the rainfall. Orographic lift is a powerful force in meteorology. As moist air ascends the mountain slopes, it cools and condenses, forming thick, heavy clouds. The higher the air rises, the more moisture it releases, resulting in torrential rain concentrated along the windward slopes. The cooling of the air was rapid and relentless, causing water vapor to condense into dense, dark clouds. These clouds, heavy with moisture, unleashed a continuous barrage of rain, darkening the sky and saturating the land below. What followed was not just a rainstorm, but a sustained atmospheric assault. The deluge poured over the landscape with a force and persistence rarely witnessed in this region. In some high-altitude areas, rainfall totals exceeded 300 millimeters in less than 48 hours, an amount that would typically fall over several months. The sheer volume of water was staggering. The ground, already saturated from previous spring rains, was unable to absorb the sudden onslaught. The soil reached its limit, and water began to pool and flow across the surface. The sky seemed to open without end, releasing a torrent that rivers, streams and soil were utterly unprepared to handle. The hydrological balance was shattered. Beneath the relentless rain, the ground was primed for catastrophe. The preceding winter had left a deep snowpack in the mountains, and the warmth of spring was already melting it, sending meltwater into the rivers. Meltwater from the snowpack was already flowing into the headwaters of the Bow, Elbow and Highwood rivers, raising their levels before the first raindrop even fell. The heavy, warm rain accelerated the melting process, sending even more water surging into the river systems. The rivers swelled, their currents growing faster and more dangerous. The combination of intense rainfall and rapid snowmelt created a hydrological surge, an explosive increase in water volume that neither force could have produced alone. Streams and tributaries, already swollen, transformed into raging torrents. Their waters, thick with mud, rocks and debris, tore at the landscape, carving new paths and eroding ancient banks. Natural drainage systems, creeks, culverts and channels were rapidly overwhelmed. The sheer volume of water exceeded their capacity, forcing water to spill over and seek new routes. Water surged through every available path, carving new channels, eroding banks and carrying with it a slurry of earth, rocks and uprooted trees. The landscape itself was being reshaped in real time. The forces at play were immense, a confluence of atmospheric pressure, temperature gradients and moisture, all interacting on a colossal scale. The energy released was equivalent to that of a major natural disaster. The stationary weather pattern acted like a giant faucet, turned on full and locked in place, pouring rain directly onto the mountains for days without reprieve. The atmospheric river continued to supply a near-endless stream of moisture, while the melting snowpack added its own relentless contribution to the floodwaters, compounding the disaster. All these elements, atmospheric river, stalled low-pressure system, orographic lift, saturated ground and melting snowpack, merged into a perfect storm, a recipe for disaster that was both scientifically remarkable and terrifying in its consequences. The water gathered in the high country, building momentum as it surged through valleys and canyons, its energy growing as it prepared to descend upon the plains below. From the smallest creek beds to the largest river channels, the floodwaters moved with unstoppable force, overwhelming everything in their path. The stage was set for one of Alberta's most devastating natural disasters, a testament to the raw power of nature's converging forces. The first place to face the unrestrained force of the flood was the mountain town of Canmore. Nestled at the foot of the Rockies, Canmore is a community shaped by the landscape, accustomed to the shifting moods of the mountains and the ever-present creek that winds through its heart. But on June 20th, 2013, the familiar became unrecognizable. Cougar Creek, usually a dry, rocky channel for much of the year, transformed in a matter of hours. What was once a gentle trickle became a monstrous, roaring river of mud and debris, surging with unstoppable energy. The water, thick and heavy, carried with it massive boulders and entire trees, battering everything in its path. The sound was relentless. A deep, thunderous roar that echoed through the valley, shaking the ground and filling the air with a sense of dread. The banks of the creek, which had seemed so solid, were devoured in minutes, collapsing into the torrent as the earth gave way. Boulders the size of cars tumbled downstream, colliding with a force that sent tremors through the ground. The environmental impact was immediate and severe. The floodwaters scoured the land, stripping away topsoil and exposing the raw, rocky earth beneath. Trees that had stood for decades were uprooted and swept away, their roots dangling in the current or left exposed on the eroded banks. The creek, no longer confined to its channel, carved a new, wider path through the landscape. Forests and fields were torn apart, and the natural contours of the land were erased as water forced its way through, creating new channels and leaving behind a scarred terrain. Backyards vanished into the churning water, followed by decks and fences, as the flood carved a new, wider path through the neighbourhood. Parkland and open spaces were submerged, their grassy surfaces replaced by swirling, muddy water. The water was not simply rising, it was violently reshaping the land, tearing through soil, uprooting trees, and destroying everything in its way. Roads that once connected the town were severed, submerged beneath muddy water, or washed away entirely. Asphalt was peeled back, and entire sections of roadway disappeared, leaving only jagged edges and gaping holes. The surging waters of Cougar Creek tore out a massive section of the Trans-Canada Highway, the main link to the rest of the country, leaving a gaping wound in the landscape. The highway, once a symbol of connection, was now a broken line cut off by the relentless force of nature. Bridges that spanned the creek were either swept away or left dangerously unstable, their supports undermined by the flood. Concrete pilings were scoured by the current, and debris piled up against the remaining structures, threatening further collapse. Storm drains and culverts designed to manage normal flows were overwhelmed. Water surged through infrastructure, bursting from manholes and flooding streets as the town's systems buckled under the pressure. Canmore became an island, surrounded by water, isolated from the outside world as the floodwaters continued to rise. Access routes were cut off, and the town's infrastructure was left battered and broken. The landscape itself was transformed. Creek beds widened, new channels cut through forests and fields, and the familiar contours of the town erased by the force of nature. The aftermath revealed toppled fences, debris piles, and a panorama of altered land, with mist rising from the floodwaters in the dawn light. The destructive power was absolute, a stark reminder of how quickly nature can reclaim what has been built. The scars left behind were not just on the infrastructure, but on the very earth itself. As the rain continued to fall over the mountains, the floodwaters gathered strength, surging through Canmore and pouring out onto the plains below. The deluge in the mountains was only the beginning, as the immense volume of water that had torn through Canmore now rushed downstream, gathering even more force as it moved toward the communities beyond. As the floodwaters surged out of the foothills, they converged on the town of High River. The town, named for the Highwood River, is usually defined by its tranquil waterway, a source of life, recreation, and natural beauty. But on this day the river transformed into a force of utter destruction, reshaping the very landscape it once nourished. Fed by unprecedented runoff from the mountains, the Highwood River swelled to a size and speed never before recorded. The water, thick with silt and debris, breached its banks and poured into the community, not as a gentle rise, but as a sudden, violent wave. The riverbanks, once lined with grass and trees, were torn away, leaving raw, exposed earth and uprooted trunks in their wake. The surge swept through the town with astonishing speed, overwhelming every barrier in its path. Water rose from ankle-deep to waist-deep in mere minutes, submerging entire neighbourhoods beneath a relentless tide. Streets and sidewalks were ripped apart, their surfaces buckled and fractured by the force of the current. Streets vanished beneath murky, fast-flowing canals, filled with dangerous debris. Vehicles once parked safely along curbs were tossed about by the current, colliding and drifting through the waterlogged landscape. The floodwater scoured the ground, stripping away topsoil and leaving behind a barren, muddy wasteland. The floodwater climbed relentlessly, submerging homes and businesses, rising up staircases and filling every available space. Parks and green spaces disappeared beneath layers of silt, while playgrounds and public areas were left unrecognizable, buried in mud and debris. Infrastructure buckled under the strain, with streetlights and signs bent or toppled by the force of the water. As night fell, the town was plunged into darkness. The only sounds were the rush of water and the creaking of structures under strain. Bridges and culverts were washed away, severing vital connections and leaving roads abruptly ending in swirling water. The official systems were overwhelmed, and the floodwaters continued to rise, isolating the community from the outside world. In the days that followed, High River remained a ghost town, submerged in a stagnant, toxic soup of river water, gasoline and raw sewage. Industrial areas were inundated, with chemicals and oil leaking into the flood, further contaminating the landscape. Piles of debris and broken materials collected in eddies, forming islands of destruction amid the water. When the waters finally receded, the devastation was overwhelming. Homes and buildings stood empty, their interiors filled with a thick layer of reeking mud. Sheds and garages had collapsed, and fences were toppled or swept away. Yards and gardens were stripped bare, the soil gouged out and replaced with a heavy, suffocating silt. The town of High River had not just been flooded, it had been scoured, leaving behind deep scars on both the landscape and the structures. The aftermath was a haunting reminder of nature's power, with cracked earth, ruined buildings and uprooted trees marking the long road to recovery that had only just begun. The torrent of water that had devastated Canmore and High River was now surging relentlessly toward Calgary, Canada's fourth largest city. With a population of over 1 million, the magnitude of the threat was staggering. The city braced itself as dark clouds loomed overhead, casting a shadow over the sprawling urban landscape. Calgary sits at the confluence of the Bow and Elbow rivers, both now swollen to historic levels, their currents churning with debris and silt. On June 20th, a state of local emergency was declared as the city's leadership recognized the scale of the impending disaster. The city had some warning, but the sheer volume of water bearing down on Calgary was almost unimaginable. It was a slow-motion catastrophe, a relentless wall of water, inching ever closer to the heart of the metropolis, threatening everything in its path. As the rivers rose, low-lying neighbourhoods became increasingly vulnerable, their streets and avenues lying directly in the path of the encroaching flood. The downtown core, usually alive with activity, was transformed into a ghostly expanse, its streets deserted and businesses shuttered. The familiar sounds of city life faded, replaced by the steady, ominous rise of water echoing through empty streets. The Elbow River was the first to breach its banks, sending torrents of water through the community of Mission and transforming entire neighbourhoods into waterways. Soon after, the Bow River, swollen with runoff from the mountains, surged higher, its powerful current sweeping past city buildings and infrastructure. Parks and pathways along the riverbanks vanished beneath the floodwaters, and entire communities were submerged, their outlines barely visible from above. The city's infrastructure groaned under the pressure. Roads buckled, utilities failed, and bridges strained as the water continued to rise. Landmarks that once defined Calgary's skyline were now surrounded or submerged, the floodwaters showing no regard for history or heritage. The Saddle Dome, an iconic arena, was inundated. Water reached up to the 10th row of seats, submerging the ice surface and event level. The interior, usually echoing with cheers, was now eerily silent beneath the murky floodwaters. The world-famous Calgary Stampede grounds, set to host festivities in just 2 weeks, were completely underwater, rides and tents barely visible above the surface. The Calgary Zoo, perched on an island in the Bow River, was encircled by rising water, its enclosures and pathways threatened by the relentless flood. Throughout the night, the zoo became a scene of urgent activity as staff worked to safeguard the animals, moving them to higher ground as the water crept ever closer. The cityscape took on a surreal quality. Floodwaters reflected the city lights, and the familiar urban environment was transformed into a watery maze. As the rivers peaked, vast swathes of Calgary became a murky lake, with only rooftops and treetops breaking the surface. Bridges were closed, power was cut to the downtown core, and the city's skyline faded into darkness as the floodwaters advanced. The flood was a humbling display of nature's power, overwhelming even the most modern of cityscapes. The headquarters of Canada's energy industry stood silent, their entrances submerged, as daily life ground to a halt. Upstream, engineers at the Ghost Lake Dam monitored the surging water, working tirelessly to hold back as much as possible. Despite their efforts, the sheer force of the flood could only be mitigated, not stopped, as water spilled over and surged downstream. Calgary, transformed by the deluge, faced the greatest natural disaster in its history, a city forever changed by the power of water. The city's stormwater management system was pushed to its limits, with flood barriers and levees straining to hold back the deluge. Water treatment plants faced unprecedented challenges as engineers worked around the clock to protect critical infrastructure from the encroaching floodwaters. Electrical substations were submerged, causing widespread power outages and complicating the city's response efforts. The transportation network was severely impacted, with major roads and railways submerged, disrupting the flow of goods and services. Natural habitats along the riverbanks were also affected, with wildlife displaced and ecosystems disrupted by the rising waters. Green spaces and recreational areas, once bustling with activity, were now submerged, their vibrant landscapes replaced by murky floodwaters. Waste management facilities were under threat, with workers striving to protect treatment plants from the encroaching waters to prevent further contamination. Despite the city's extensive flood mitigation efforts, including sandbags and temporary barriers, the sheer volume of water overwhelmed many defences. As the waters began to recede, Calgary faced the daunting task of recovery and rebuilding, a testament to the city's resilience in the face of nature's fury. After leaving Calgary, the floodwaters pressed eastward, sweeping across the open prairies. The South Saskatchewan River, swollen and relentless, carved a new path through the land, its currents reshaping the contours of the earth as it surged toward Medicine Hat. The city of Medicine Hat sits at the confluence of river and prairie, its low-lying terrain making it especially vulnerable to the river's rise. As the flood approached, the land itself became a battleground, fields transformed into shallow lakes, and the riverbanks, once gentle, now braced against the force of the water. The river's advance was visible in the landscape. Water crept steadily over the flat prairie, pooling in depressions and filling every hollow. The city's defences, long lines of sandbagged barriers, became new temporary features of the land, tracing the river's edge and holding back the encroaching flood. From above, the contrast was stark. Some neighbourhoods remained dry, protected by the careful placement of dikes and sandbags, while others bore the marks of the river's reach. Streets and yards submerged, water lines etched onto buildings, and the land itself scarred by the flood's passage. The river's power was evident in every bend and curve as it pressed against the city's boundaries. The sandbag dikes, rising from the earth, formed a fragile barrier between the swollen water and the vulnerable land beyond. Beyond the city, the floodwaters spread across the prairie, submerging rural communities and transforming familiar landscapes into vast, reflective expanses. The land, usually dry and open, was now a patchwork of water and earth, the boundaries between river and field blurred by the deluge. As the floodwaters continued their journey, they reached the Siksika First Nation, where the Bow River winds through a broad, open reserve. Here, the land is deeply tied to the river, with homes and cultural sites nestled close to its banks. The river's arrival was sudden and overwhelming. Water surged over the floodplain, overtaking the land and sweeping into low-lying areas. The river, once a source of life and connection, became a force of destruction, submerging fields, eroding banks, and leaving behind a landscape transformed. The impact on the land was profound. Entire neighbourhoods were overtaken, the water encroaching on yards and driveways, leaving behind mud, debris, and the unmistakable marks of its passage. The scars of the flood were visible in the remains of destroyed homes and the altered course of the river itself. On higher ground, rows of temporary shelters appeared, their presence a stark reminder of the land lost to the flood. The river's force had not only displaced people, but had also reshaped the very ground they called home. The floodwaters did not spare the community's heritage. Cultural sites and traditional structures near the river's edge suffered damage, and the erosion of the river bank revealed the vulnerability of ancestral land to the relentless power of water. In the aftermath, the landscape bore silent witness to the disaster. Empty gathering spaces and vacant benches stood on ground that had once been vibrant with life, now marked by the slow process of recovery and renewal. The story of Medicine Hat and Siksika First Nation is written in the land and water, the river's path, the scars on the earth, and the enduring presence of the prairie, shaped and reshaped by the flood. In the darkest hours of the flood, the true spirit of Alberta was reflected not only in its people, but in the land itself. The rivers, forests and wildlife all caught in the struggle, adapting and enduring as the waters rose. When official emergency services were stretched to their limits, the environment became both battleground and survivor. Rivers carved new paths through fields and forests, while sandbag barriers and makeshift levees stood as the last defence for groves of trembling aspen and stands of spruce. The stories of resilience were written in the silent streets and the submerged parks, but also in the battered wetlands and meadows, where waterfowl found new temporary lakes and deer navigated unfamiliar waterlogged terrain. In High River, the sight of heavy machinery forging paths through the water was mirrored by the resilience of the land, ancient cottonwoods withstanding the current, their roots gripping the soil as water rushed past. These machines, repurposed for rescue, worked alongside nature's own defences. Beaver dams holding back torrents and natural ridges channeling water away from vulnerable habitats. The formal response was massive, but the environment responded too. Wetlands absorbed floodwaters, and forests acted as buffers, slowing the surge and protecting the land beyond. As the Canadian Armed Forces deployed their resources, the rivers and creeks revealed their own power, shaping the land, uprooting trees and creating new channels that would become part of Alberta's landscape for years to come. These changes, though devastating, also brought renewal. Silt and nutrients deposited by the floodwaters would nourish the soil, and new wetlands would become havens for birds and amphibians. The coordinated response of agencies was echoed in the natural world as animals adapted. Foxes and coyotes seeking higher ground, and fish swimming through newly connected waterways. From above, helicopters revealed a transformed landscape, forests reflected in vast temporary lakes, and winding rivers now braided and swollen, their courses forever altered. The coordination of so many resources was mirrored by the interconnectedness of the ecosystem, each part responding to the crisis in its own way, creating a web of resilience. As supplies poured in for human communities, the land itself received a different kind of aid, fresh water revitalizing parched areas, and debris providing new shelter for small creatures. Evacuation centres bustled with activity, while outside fields and forests became sanctuaries for displaced wildlife, offering food and shelter in the aftermath. Technology tracked the flood's progress, but nature's own signals, birdsong returning to quieted woods, the slow retreat of water from meadows, marked the beginning of recovery. Across the province, natural shelters, groves, thickets and high ground became safe havens for animals and plants alike, offering refuge from the relentless waters. The outpouring of support was visible not only in human aid, but in the resilience of the land. Wildflowers blooming in silt-rich soil and new growth emerging from battered ground. The message of Alberta Strong was echoed in the resilience of the environment, nature's quiet determination to recover, adapt and thrive. Even as Calgary faced its own crisis, the city's green spaces and riverbanks absorbed the shock, their roots and soil working to hold back the flood. One of the most powerful symbols of resilience was the land itself, muddy, battered, but ready to support new life and new beginnings. The stampede grounds, transformed by water and mud, became a testament to the power of nature and the possibility of renewal. As machinery worked to clear the grounds, the land itself began to heal, grass pushing through silt and birds returning to the river banks. The reopening of the stampede was not just a triumph of human will, but a celebration of the land's ability to recover, come hell or high water. It was more than just an event. It was a declaration of the enduring strength of Alberta's environment, a landscape shaped by water but defined by resilience. When the floodwaters finally receded, Alberta's landscape was forever changed. The transformation was not just visible in the battered towns, but across the very fabric of the natural world. The rivers, once following familiar paths, had been forced to carve new channels through the land. In the foothills and mountains, gentle creeks became roaring torrents, gouging deep canyons and scattering boulders and debris across the valleys. Entire slopes collapsed, and the contours of the land were redrawn by the relentless force of water. Riverbanks, once lush with vegetation, were stripped bare. The floodwaters eroded soil and uprooted trees, leaving behind raw, exposed earth and tangled masses of roots. In some places, tons of sediment buried delicate ecosystems, suffocating plant life and altering the composition of the soil. The flood's power was evident in the reshaped riverbeds. Gravel bars and sandbanks appeared where none had existed before, while old channels were abandoned and new ones cut through the landscape. Fish habitats were disrupted, with spawning grounds buried beneath layers of silt and debris. Wetlands and low-lying areas, vital for wildlife and water filtration, were inundated and transformed. Pools of stagnant water lingered for weeks, changing the chemistry of the soil and creating new habitats for some species while displacing others. The forests along the rivers bore the scars of the deluge. Stands of trees were flattened or swept away, and the remaining trunks leaned at odd angles, their roots exposed and clinging to eroded banks. The loss of vegetation increased the risk of future erosion and changed the microclimate of these riparian zones. In the mountains, the floodwaters unleashed landslides and rockfalls, sending cascades of debris down into the valleys. Rubble-filled canyons replaced gentle slopes, and the landscape took on a raw, unsettled appearance that would take decades to heal. The flood also altered the flow of water across the region. Where once streams trickled gently, now new channels cut through fields and forests, redirecting water and changing the hydrology of entire watersheds. Some lakes and ponds expanded, while others were drained or filled with sediment. The Calgary Zoo, located on an island in the Bow River, became a microcosm of the environmental upheaval. Floodwaters swept through animal enclosures, depositing mud and debris, and transforming the landscape into a patchwork of waterlogged ground and eroded banks. Across the region, the natural balance was disrupted. The intricate web of life that depended on stable riverbanks, clean water, and healthy soil was thrown into disarray. Some species found new opportunities in the altered environment, while others struggled to survive in the changed conditions. The scars of the flood were not just physical, but ecological. The event served as a stark reminder of the dynamic and sometimes violent nature of Alberta's landscapes. The rivers that nourish life here also possess the power to reshape the land in a matter of days, leaving behind a transformed world that will continue to evolve for generations to come. In the aftermath of the devastation, Alberta's true strength was revealed not in its buildings or economy, but in the enduring resilience of its land and the structures that remained. The landscape, once overwhelmed by water, began a slow and steady process of healing. The recovery process was long and arduous, marked by a determined effort to restore what had been lost and to fortify what could be saved. Nature, too, began its own recovery, as grasses pushed through the mud and riverbanks slowly regained their shape. Clean-up was a monumental task, with every street and neighbourhood bearing the marks of the flood's power. The land itself bore scars, deep gouges in the earth, toppled trees and fields blanketed in silt. Rubber boots and shovels became symbols of recovery. As basements were cleared, and the remnants of the flood were painstakingly removed from every corner. Along the rivers, sandbags and temporary barriers gave way to the slow return of native plants and grasses. The spirit of Alberta was reflected in the steady progress of recovery, visible in every repaired road and restored building. Infrastructure was not only rebuilt, but reimagined, stronger, more resilient and better able to withstand the forces of nature. The flood forced a critical reassessment of how communities are built and protected, prompting a new era of planning and preparation. Riverbanks were reshaped, levees strengthened and natural buffers restored. It was a harsh lesson in hydrology and urban planning, with every detail scrutinized for future resilience. Monitoring equipment and new warning systems became part of the landscape, quietly watching over the rivers. Governments at all levels began to invest heavily in flood mitigation, launching projects to protect against future disasters. Wetlands were restored, and new green spaces were created to absorb floodwaters. New dikes were constructed, river channels deepened, and upstream reservoirs created to better control water flow during extreme weather events. The land itself was reshaped to work with the water, not against it. In high river, entire neighbourhoods in the floodway were removed, and the land was returned to a natural state to serve as a buffer against future floods. Nature was given space to recover, and green corridors now trace the paths where water once surged. The disaster prompted a fundamental shift in thinking, from simply rebuilding to building back, better and smarter, with resilience at the forefront. Infrastructure and the natural world were woven together in new ways. The memory of the 2013 flood is now woven into the very landscape of southern Alberta, marked by memorials and reminders of what was endured. Markers and signs tell the story of both loss and renewal. These sites serve as permanent reminders of the power of nature and the vulnerability of even the most prepared communities. The land itself holds the memory, in every scar and every new shoot of green. For those who witnessed the flood, the sound of heavy rain still echoes with a sense of unease, a reminder of the events that unfolded. The landscape too responds, absorbing, channeling and remembering the water. Yet the memory is also one of renewal, as the land and infrastructure have been restored and improved. Nature's recovery is visible in every blade of grass and every rebuilt bridge. The story is one of coordinated response, of the courage shown by those who protected the land and infrastructure, and of the resilience built into the very fabric of Alberta's communities, reflected in the harmony between nature and engineering. The event tested the province like never before, but it also led to stronger, more connected systems of support and preparedness, both human and ecological. Today, more than a decade later, the scars are still visible to those who know where to look, etched into the landscape and the built environment. But alongside them, new growth flourishes. But these scars are overshadowed by the unmistakable signs of recovery and renewal. The land, once battered, now stands as a testament to resilience. The rivers now flow more calmly, guided by new and improved flood defences that stand as silent guardians. Nature and infrastructure work together, shaping a safer future. The rebuilt homes and revitalized communities are a testament to the enduring spirit and determination that define this place. The land and its infrastructure have been transformed side by side. The flood of floods was a tragedy that brought immense loss and hardship, but it also left behind a powerful legacy. A deeper respect for nature, a stronger sense of place, and an unshakable belief in the ability to overcome adversity, written into the very landscape of Alberta. As Alberta's rivers settled into their new courses, and the scars of the flood faded from view, the landscape itself became a living classroom, offering a rare opportunity to observe nature's processes in real time. The floodwaters had carved new channels, reshaped riverbanks, and deposited layers of silt and debris across fields and forests, creating a dynamic mosaic of habitats. These changes provided scientists with a unique chance to study how rivers naturally evolve, how sediment is redistributed, and how floodplains recover after extreme events. The layers of silt and debris acted as natural fertilizers, enriching the soil and supporting the rapid regrowth of native vegetation. Aerial surveys revealed patterns invisible from the ground, meandering streams, newly formed wetlands, and stretches where the water had permanently altered its path, demonstrating the river's power to reshape the land. These natural experiments provided critical data, allowing for more accurate mapping of floodplains and identification of high-risk zones for future flooding. Environmental monitoring equipment recorded changes in water quality, sediment load and soil composition, offering insights into how ecosystems respond and adapt to sudden disturbances. Wetlands, once overlooked or drained for development, were now recognized as vital buffers, slowing floodwaters, filtering debris, and providing essential habitat for countless species. The flood highlighted the importance of these natural systems in absorbing excess water and reducing the impact of future floods. Restoration projects began, returning some areas to their natural states to act as living defences against future floods, reinforcing the value of working with nature rather than against it. Each season brought new signs of regeneration. Native grasses took root in the fresh sediment, stabilizing the soil and preventing erosion. Expanded wetlands provided new stopover points for migratory birds, while fish found new spawning grounds in the reshaped rivers, illustrating the interconnectedness of water, land, and wildlife. The altered waterways created fresh habitats, supporting greater biodiversity and offering scientists a living laboratory to study ecological succession. The landscape, though changed, demonstrated remarkable resilience, adapting to new conditions and revealing the complexity of nature's response to disturbance. These lessons from the waters continue to inform Alberta's approach to land management and disaster preparedness, emphasizing the need to respect natural processes and restore ecological balance. By studying the land's response, researchers and planners are developing strategies that work in harmony with nature, building resilience for the future. The rivers, once a source of devastation, now serve as reminders of both the power and the wisdom inherent in the natural world, teaching us to adapt, restore, and respect the forces that shape our environment. In the end, the greatest lesson from the floodwaters is that nature, when given space and respect, can heal, adapt, and thrive, guiding us toward a more sustainable future. As the months slipped by, the land quietly embraced its transformation. The scars left by the flood began to soften as dawn after dawn painted the horizon with hope. In the absence of human footprints, nature began to reclaim flooded fields and battered forests. Grasses pushed through the silt, and saplings took root where old giants had fallen, their leaves unfurling in the gentle light. Silt-laden waters receded, leaving behind fertile ground where wildflowers soon erupted in bursts of colour. Lupines, asters and fireweed painted the muddy earth, their petals a silent celebration of survival. Beavers, undeterred by the chaos, set about rebuilding their lodges, weaving together twigs and mud along the newly carved banks. Their tireless work shaped new ponds and channels, creating fresh habitats for countless creatures. Deer and foxes ventured out, exploring unfamiliar meadows shaped by the flood's hand. They moved cautiously at first, then with growing confidence, as the land offered up new sources of food and shelter. Above, flocks of waterfowl circled over broad, shimmering wetlands, some old, some newly created, drawn to the abundance of food and shelter. Ducks and geese settled among the reeds, their calls echoing across the water. Dragonflies danced above still ponds, their wings catching the sun as they skimmed the water's surface. They hunted in the humid air, a sign that life was returning to every corner of the floodplain. In the rivers, schools of fish navigated fresh channels, instinctively adapting to the changed currents and gravel beds. Trout and minnows darted between stones, finding new spawning grounds in the reshaped waterways. Beneath the surface, a quieter story unfolded. Aquatic plants stretched toward the light, and tiny invertebrates scuttled through the sediment, rebuilding the base of the food web. Seeds buried deep in layers of mud began to sprout, their roots anchoring the soil, their leaves reaching for the light. Mosses and ferns crept across damp stones, knitting the ground together. Over time, these silent acts of renewal stitched the landscape together once more, weaving resilience into the fabric of Alberta's wild places. Meadows thickened, forests closed their gaps, and wetlands teemed with new life. Without fanfare or witness, nature pressed on, proving that recovery is not only possible, but inevitable. The wind carried seeds to distant banks, and rain coaxed them to life. In every green shoot and every ripple across a pond, the land whispered a promise. Where there is disruption, there is also rebirth. The silent recovery of flora, fauna, and landscape continued, a testament to nature's enduring strength. As the seasons turned, the wild inhabitants of Alberta's rivers and forests ventured further into their renewed domains. The flood had reshaped the land, creating new habitats and opportunities for life to flourish. Elk herds grazed along the fresh grass of riverbanks, their silhouettes framed by early morning mist. The flood had brought nutrient-rich silt, fostering lush growth that provided ample food for these majestic creatures. Otters slid playfully down muddy slopes into clear, cold streams, chasing minnows through channels sculpted by the flood. These new waterways became playgrounds for the otters, teeming with life. Overhead, eagles soared, scanning the waterways for signs of life, while songbirds filled the air with new melodies, their calls echoing across the rejuvenated landscape. The trees, now vibrant and full, provided perfect perches for these avian choristers. In the wetlands, frogs emerged from hidden burrows, croaking in chorus as dusk settled in. The flood had created new ponds and marshes, ideal breeding grounds for amphibians. Turtles basked on sun-warmed logs, while muskrats built new homes among the reeds. The flood had reshaped their environment, offering new spaces for these creatures to thrive. Insects, too, flourished. Bees and butterflies flitted from blossom to blossom, pollinating the wildflowers that now painted the floodplain with colour. The flood had dispersed seeds far and wide, leading to a burst of floral diversity. Where devastation once reigned, the wild had returned, each creature playing its part in the intricate balance of this revived ecosystem. The flood had acted as a reset button, allowing nature to reclaim and restore. Life moved quietly, persistently forward. The animals adapted to their new surroundings, finding harmony in the transformed landscape. In this shared sanctuary, the pulse of nature beat strong and steady, a testament to the enduring power of the wild to heal and thrive, even after the greatest upheaval. The flood had not just been a force of destruction, but a catalyst for renewal, bringing life back to Alberta's rivers and forests in ways unimaginable. In the aftermath of the 2013 Alberta flood, the landscape bore the marks of powerful change. Rivers, once confined to familiar channels, had carved new paths through the valley floors, their courses altered by the force of the water. Banks were reshaped, exposing fresh soil and creating gravel bars where none had existed before. These changes brought opportunity for new plant life to take root, with willows and cottonwoods sprouting along the water's edge, stabilizing the banks and providing vital shelter for countless species. Forests, too, felt the flood's touch. Where water had swept through low-lying woodlands, it left behind a mosaic of fallen trees and open clearings. Sunlight now reached the forest floor, encouraging the growth of shrubs and wildflowers that had lain dormant for years. This burst of vegetation attracted insects, which in turn drew birds and small mammals back into the recovering woods. Wetlands expanded as floodwaters lingered in natural depressions, creating new ponds and marshes. These habitats became sanctuaries for amphibians and aquatic insects, whose populations surged in the months that followed. Fish found new spawning grounds in backwaters and side channels, while beavers and muskrats set to work building lodges and dams in the altered waterways. Even as some species thrived, others were challenged by the changed environment. Nesting sites were lost and familiar territories were transformed. Yet over time the intricate web of life adapted, weaving new connections in the ever-evolving ecosystem. The flood had imposed hardship, but it also fostered resilience, ensuring that Alberta's rivers, forests and wetlands remained vibrant and alive. The echo of the flood continues in every leaf, every ripple and every call of the wild, a reminder that nature, though vulnerable, is also endlessly adaptable. In the years that followed the flood, the story of Alberta's transformed landscape unfolded under the watchful eye of science. Teams of researchers set up monitoring stations along rivers and wetlands, collecting water samples and tracking sediment flows. High-resolution satellite imagery captured the shifting courses of streams and the gradual greening of flood-scoured earth. Biologists deployed motion-activated cameras and acoustic sensors to track the return of wildlife and the resurgence of amphibians in newly formed ponds. Drones soared above the forests, mapping the spread of willow and cottonwood seedlings and documenting the gradual return of tree canopy. Soil scientists measured nutrient cycles in the freshly deposited silt, while botanists catalogued the waves of plant colonization across gravel bars and clearings. Year after year, data accumulated, a mosaic of charts, graphs and time-lapse images revealing the pace and pattern of recovery. Patterns emerged. Some areas rebounded quickly, rich with new life, while others remained scarred, slow to heal. Unexpected discoveries surfaced as well, such as the resurgence of rare wildflowers and the appearance of migratory birds in newly created wetlands. Through this meticulous observation, scientists uncovered not only the resilience of the ecosystem, but also its vulnerabilities. Their findings guide ongoing restoration efforts and inform strategies for future floods, ensuring that Alberta's rivers and forests are not just observed, but understood and protected for years to come.